My name is Chang, and I'm teaching biblical studies here, and I'm really happy to be here. And this is very interesting set of seminar, 2 days with 5 different people, so that you can really evaluate and judge who's the better teacher or something like that. So. But anyway.
We might have favorites who maybe.
We take cash.
One's the best, obviously. Saying I'm hoping I get a pass in this assignment.
I can offer cash. Anyone else like Caitlin, because you are on me, on my mentee, so I have the authority to pass you or not. So. Just kidding. But anyway, he's really because we have Howard, and I saw his slide. It's just going through ancient days to the whole history, 2,000 years of history, how we get the knowledge, right? And it was interesting.
It was.
Yeah. Okay. And then we had Archie, right?
Yeah.
Interestingly, Archie, because he's doing theologies, theology is on top of biblical theology. Biblical theology is on top of biblical studies. So, I'm doing Old Testament thing, and Brian Rapsky tomorrow will be New Testament thing. So, supposed to be Archie has to do it later on after me and Brian, and so it's the ladder, but you guys just jump to the top and actually going down. So for this session, so that's what's happening, and then we will have Mark Naylor, one of the all-time favorite by the student. He's awesome person. He will wrap it up in a missiological perspective, what the Sojourner means. So for now, my assignment is to do with the Old Testament theology, if it is possible, of the Sojourner. So we're gonna look at some interesting stuff. So let me start with this interesting picture. I don't know whether you might have seen this stele. It's a Moabite stone or Mesha stele. It's been built in 840 BC by the Moabite king, and he's actually accounting he wrote that his accomplishment, battle and when that he won against the Israelites. The interesting thing in the Moabite stone, the part of that you see, this is the we don't know what it is, but we know that now. The Moabite stone, that is the first mention of God of Israel, Yahweh, the outside of the Bible. So it's people knew Yahweh, or not Israelites. And in the sentence, it was read Omri was the king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab, and I took the vessel of Yahweh. But the reason that I brought this picture is because of John Spencer's article. He wrote an article about Sojourner in Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, and talks about this, one of the sentences in the Moabite stone. In the Mesha inscription or Moabite stone, there is a line which lists, quote, 7,000 men and gerund, and women Geret, and female slaves, end quote, among those who were killed by Mesha in his attack upon Israel. And Spencer continues, it is clear that Geren, a masculine plural noun, refers to the male foreigners, and Geret, feminine plural noun, refers to female foreigners who live among the Israelites, and that these foreigners are seen as being in a class distinct from men and slaves in Israel. So, and the term that is a Moabite stone, but in the Hebrew Bible we have ger, noun ger, and gerim in plural form in many places, and those are that is the term to be translated into sojourner. So what we are going to do is we're doing some unboxing of the Bible. So I believe you all have Logos. You have Logos. Okay?
I just downloaded it.
Yeah, yeah. And you're gonna be one group. So yeah. So and Nikki will break you into 3 different groups in Zoom.
Yeah.
So 2 in 1. And I think Elijah and Aaron are grouped already.
They are, yep.
And the other 4 will be into 2 different groups. And what we are going to do is we're going to find and study the Hebrew term ger, or you can find sojourner in the ESV, or like sometimes it's alien, not the one that you're thinking of right now. Alien or stranger, it translated into English, different versions translate different. So it's the resident alien or stranger or sojourner. So, but like I want you to try to find the ger in the Old Testament, group 1 in Exodus and Genesis, group 2 in Deuteronomy, Joshua, 2 Samuel, group 3 Leviticus and Numbers, and group 4 poetic literatures like Jeremiah, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Isaiah. So there's a bunch of like instances that you can find ger in those texts, and try to find as many as possible, and look at how the term is meant, being used. If it is paired with other words, then how does it distinctive from each other, and in what context, what is talking about. So basically we are doing the study like so. So like group 1 will be
Okay, so group 1 is Elijah and Aaron.
Elijah and Aaron. Yeah.
Okay. And then Deuteronomy, Joshua, 2 Samuel is Charlie and Jane. Leviticus and Numbers is Caitlin and Rachel. And then the prophetic lit is those of us in the room here. So
Great.
How much time do they have?
I'll give you like 15-20 minutes. So you try to find every single case of ger in those texts in your group and try to study it. And bring whatever you find. Bring back in and we will discuss what we found. Okay? So, good to see you come back. Like, you guys enjoy the time and find some funds there? Hopefully. And let's talk about it then. Like, for the group 1, Exodus and Chronicles, Exodus and Genesis, sorry about it. What do you find about the use of ger in those texts?
Sure. So initially, what you find in Genesis is Abram. First, God refers to him as a sojourner.
Mm-hmm.
And later, he's talking to the Hittites, and he's asking to buy land, and he's referring to then himself as a sojourner, right? So first, like God gives him that title, and then he shares that with others. And then there's just quite a few references in Exodus about it that point to they kind of just relate back in the dispensation of the law to be mindful of sojourners and considerate to them, because you once were sojourners in foreign land.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Anything else?
You think, Aaron?
No, I don't think he's. Now I feel like we're missing something.
No. You know what? The 2 things that you just mentioned is, I think it's really, really critical and important. Like Abraham identifies himself as Ger, sojourner, in relation to Hittites. And in the context of, in what context?
Buying land from
Buying
there.
land from them. I think it's really significant. And we probably need to keep that in mind. And Exodus as well, like you just mentioned about like what did you just mention about?
How to treat them, like that. There's a certain code of respect to treat us
Like social justice laws, basically.
Yeah. In what
And-
context?
And it's rooted in being considerate of their needs because you yourselves know what it's
Right.
like in their
Yeah.
and you can
So-
empathize. Yeah.
It just gives the like theological foundation of what they're supposed to like treat Ger to them, right? So that is very important. And is there like I'm just wondering whether it's I think it was part of Exodus as well, like that is the reason. And what other instances? There's several, right?
Yeah, so like Exodus 22:21, you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of
Okay.
Egypt.
Okay.
The name of the son Gershom is like
Mhm,
I
mhm.
that for he said
Moses identified himself as Ger as well, especially in relation to Midianite land, right? So he considered himself Ger, so he named his son Gersom, right? And
God,
there's yeah, that's yeah.
right.
And yeah, I think you do a very good job. Like and let's move on to the Deuteronomy part. Who was the like?
Kelly.
That was Jane and I,
Mhm.
and we took a look at this. We tried to find all the instances of it's Ger or Jer?
Oh, Ger.
Ger, that's the one. I was wrong both times. Ger. And so looking through here, what we found, especially in Deuteronomy at the start here, is just how the rights of these foreigners and these sojourners was upheld in Jewish law. Even in like Deuteronomy 27:19, where it says, curses anyone who withholds justice from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. And we know, of course, how much widows and orphans are talked about in the Bible, and the Jewish people are called to look out for them and protect them.
Mhm.
And here you have foreigners actually brought into that same category of people who need to be who should not basically not withhold justice from them. So there's that aspect of it, of protecting the rights of foreigners. But then there also is a degree of separation as well. So in Joshua 8, verse 33, it says, and all Israel, sojourner as well as native born, with their elders and officers and their judges, stood on opposite sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, half in the front and half in the front. So basically, obviously, it's the sojourners aren't going to be the ones who are carrying the ark, or they're not in that inner circle, but yet they're still part. They're able to participate to a degree in the community and have those rights and to be respected in that sense. And then also finally, it just seems like everyone here is a sojourner, because even in 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 13, it says, and David said to the young man who told him, where do you come from? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. So the Amalekites here being referred to as sojourners as well. So basically it's like all the different nations, all the people, they're constantly on this journey and in flux, and with all the different changes and kingdoms and wars and battles going on, it seems like there's a lot of displacement happening, and people at one time, the Israelites are foreigners, and another time people coming to them are foreigners. And so it's this idea that really we're all kind of foreigners at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Yeah, it's amazing. Do you remember in what context the Joshua passage is about?
Joshua, let's see here.
What were they doing?
Let's see. I didn't look at the full context. I just we tried to get as many of these verses down as possible. So I didn't, look at the greater context there.
They were entering the promised land. It was a time when they were occupying
Exactly.
the land.
And what they're doing in Josh, it was chapter 8, right?
Reading.
Joshua 8 is some kind of
8:33.
performance. What kind of performance is that?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Do you remember like Deuteronomy 28, 29 is blessing and curses, and Moses told them like once you guys get into the promised land and do this thing, and like half of you guys stand on the Mount Ebal and the other half Mount Gerizim and doing things. And what is the thing about? And they're actually in Joshua chapter 8, they're doing that thing that Moses commanded in Deuteronomy. And what is that?
Renewal of the covenant.
Pardon me?
The renewal of the covenant.
Yeah, renewal of the covenant.
Or are they kind of like reenacting Sinai?
Yeah, like they're the second generation, right? And like making a covenant in a different form. So Mount Sinai, we have Exodus chapter 19 to 24. We have very specific like a scene that Moses mediating covenant between Israelite and Yahweh God. And that one, like Moses described to the second generation of the Israelite at the plain of Moab, looking at the promised land. He just re-speak one more time that like the covenant that they made before, and ask them to renew it in this way, right? So at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and in Joshua chapter 8, since they get into the land, actually they did it at Shechem, right? So yeah, in the covenant making or covenant renewal context, what you find about Ger is there, and I think it's really one of the really important things to find out. Okay, yeah, good. Like, and it's all about related to in Deuteronomy. You just mentioned it's just acting justice, right? And related to the orphan and widow and Ger are always the like 3-in-1 combination, right? So in prophetic literature as well, right? So, good, thank you. And let's go for the Leviticus and Numbers. Who's gonna do?
I can do it.
Okay.
So in Leviticus and Numbers, it's talking about how sojourners are allowed to practice sacrifices so long as Leviticus 19:33 says, when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall do him no wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So it's basically saying how you should treat a sojourner as someone, like treat them as a person, as someone with certain rights and privileges within the society. And then in Numbers it says the same thing, and allows them the privileges of like if a stranger sojourns among you and would keep the Passover to the Lord according to the statute of the Passover and according to its rule, so shall he do. You should have one statute both for the sojourner and for the natives. They were allowed to participate in Passover, as well as they're allowed to offer a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord, just as the Israelites do. So they're allowed certain privileges within society.
Exactly.
Like everyone.
Great. And especially in those texts, as you just looked at the Leviticus and Numbers, the ger comes in pair with another words, right? So ger and
Air.
yeah. Just as you just mentioned, they are should be like they participate or treated as well as like the Israelites. The Ger and Ezra. Ezra is the native born, like whoever they are, they have to participate this thing or they have to do this or something like that. And I think you find a really important thing there, you guys. And let's move on to the prophetic literature. What do you find?
All right. So we had one reference or a couple references in Isaiah. And what was that first one in Isaiah? That was in the first half. It was before they get invaded by Babylon. So while Isaiah is kind of still alive.
And they're going to attach themselves to the house of Jacob.
Yeah. So basically, it's talking about how strangers are going to come in and are going to be a part of their people and basically attaching themselves to their nation. Then what was the later one was? What that reference was Isaiah.
Chop the other Isaiah ones.
Oh, okay. So then Jeremiah basically. It's a bunch of there's a few references to how they're treating strangers, and really it's lumping strangers or sojourners or aliens or whatever the word is used. Ger is always lumped in with fatherless, orphans. So it's speaking to a certain people who are vulnerable amongst them, and God is really saying that through the prophets. In this case with Jeremiah, that how they treat those people is very, very essential to how God's going to respond to them. And then at one point, it almost seems like God is speaking to the Israelites, saying that they are acting like sojourners, because I think they're kind of like in Babylon and they're exiled.
Right.
And he's saying to stop acting like sojourners, which is interesting. Apparently they're not as vulnerable as they think they are. The rest of the references that we found in Ezekiel and Zechariah and Malachi were all having to do with either warnings against how they were treating people who had that Ger designation, or it was identifying that they have actually mistreated, and they're being kind of indicted for their sin.
I think you just mentioned a very important thing. Because we can easily think that Jeremiah, Ezekiel is the document after the return of the exile, right? Or in the exile, Babylonian exile. So that's actually happened. And so they are actually accusing the leaders that because you did that, like these covenantal curses, you just enacted. You pushed the wrong button, so they're accusing them. Something happens, right?
Yeah.
So,
and that's pretty consistent across Zechariah,
exactly.
Ezekiel, and Isaiah. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah. So, did you guys see that, in the usage of prophetic literature, Ger with the widow and orphan is pretty much in line with the use of Ger in Deuteronomy. Those who do the Deuteronomy, they're always the set, right? And interestingly, in Leviticus Numbers, they are not coming in those set. Instead, they're always coming with Ezra, the native born. So they're actually using it differently in different places. So, and what you just found, 1, 2, 3, 4, in different sets of documents, and what you just shared it's just amazing. I've spent weeks and weeks to think about it, and I wanted to put them together somehow, because Old Testament individual books are individual books, but at the same time it shows the it shows somehow how one theology, one trajectory of theology. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share how I put it together. I just get the similar findings as you just find in 20 minutes. It took.
Because you guided us.
Yeah, it took me weeks and weeks. And
Yeah, you gave us the cheat codes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I put it in a paper. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna present you how the way in which I put together. So I'm gonna read a paper, but before that, you probably need a break, 5-minute break, because. Okay, welcome back, and yeah, we just have a short time, like a brief fund, but I think you guys did really well. And what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna present you how I try to put together what you have found in 20 minutes. And the reason that I put these things together is one of the big reasons is that ger in the Old Testament usually still be considered as the reference to the outsiders who are temporarily with you. That's the definition being used by many people. But to me, it seems not likely, at least in the use of the term or concept in the Old Testament. So to me, it is like a reference to the people who used to be outsiders, who are permanently with you now. So because of the English languages, strangers or alien or even residence aliens and sojourners have those kind of a temporary status or things like that. So that's something. So one reason that I want to put together and try to argue that there are definitely more than that. That was the first reason that I put these things together. And before I start my reading, I want to remind you one more time that what we are doing and what I was doing is biblical studies and biblical theology, which is the bottom part of the theology pyramid. So on top of that, you need historical theology, how's the people throughout the history was using it, try to think about it, and then we can put it on systematic theology, how overall biblical text and how overall in the history of our studies define these things. So what I'm going to read might not fully answer the questions that you might have when you encounter these things, but hopefully give you some idea that related to this. So, does it moving?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh no, how come it's edits? Now it's moving. Okay, so I'm gonna go through this table of contents. So let me just go. Introduction. The concept of ger is a very popular issue in missiological studies. It also is a common theme in missiological studies in Korea as well, especially in relation to the multicultural conversation concerning the issues of immigration, right? Refugees and foreign labor. One of the most common Korean translations of the term ger is 나그네 in Korean. Unfortunately, the translation is somewhat problematic because the term 나그네 refers to a person who is not settled in a particular territory. The meaning of 나그네 is closer to a traveler. This translation seems not fit precisely to the concept of the term ger described in the Old Testament. Consequently, the translation may cause misuse of the term in some studies, especially when the term is used as a support to a concept of life in the world. Life in the world is a journey to the heaven. A strong image related to 나그네 here is unstable status, whereas the term ger in many cases in the Old Testament seems more stable as a legitimate part of the covenantal community. A Hebrew term ger, commonly known as sojourner, appears 93 times in the Old Testament. The majority of the instances are found in the Torah, Pentateuch, especially in Exodus to Deuteronomy. The term is commonly translated either alien or stranger in the NIV version. Sociologically, the term seems to refer to a particular group of people who moved in and dwelled among Israelites, or to their social status in Israelite Jewish community. However, there exists ambiguity in identifying who they were because different aspects of the term are emphasized in different biblical texts. Some scholars, such as Douglas and Rentorth, identify them as the remnant of the northern Israel after the Assyrian invasion. Krauss related them to the Gentile females who were ordered to be separated from their family by Ezra and Nehemiah, but remained and converted to Judaism in the post-exilic period. However, sociological identification has not been able to single out a widely accepted group of people as a reference to the term. The present study is neither seeking to identify the term to a particular group of people in Israelite history, nor to classify the social status of a group which was identified with the term. This study instead is aiming at the conceptualization of the term ger in the Old Testament. To me, it seems that the land allotment as inheritance under the covenantal context is probably one of the most important key elements in the conceptualization of ger in Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history. Furthermore, the key idea seems to be recognized and is reoriented in Ezekiel's oracle of the restored or eschatological temple and the land. Based on this framework, the present study attempts to draw a trajectory of the conceptual changes of the term in the various Old Testament texts, such as Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic histories, priestly text, and prophetic text. A missiological implication will also be suggested in view of disorientation and reorientation of the theological meaning of the term. The lexical meaning of the term ger inevitably bring attention to the issue of the resident alien, immigrant, or refugee in the field of missiology. Kyosong An states that, quote, "The issue of immigrants and refugees profoundly is a matter of others, a matter of building relationship. Furthermore, it is a matter of receptivity, hospitality, and equality that non-native requires from the society where they are living, so that in the end it becomes a matter of mission and missiology," end quote. Although missiological implication and applications of the concept of ger is important and relevant to this study, the immediate purpose of the present study is to suggest a theological trajectory of the biblical concept of the term ger in the Old Testament. Therefore, this study is constrained in suggesting a possible conceptual reference for those who intend to investigate further and understanding of the missiological issue concerning immigrants and refugees. So, let's go in turn, orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. So orientation, ger as your identity. Generally, the term ger seems to refer to a group or groups of people who are ethnically non-Israelite or foreigner, but living among Israelites. One of the first impressions of the concept is that ger is outgroup among Israelites. The term ger appears several times in pair with the term Ezra, which means native born, as its counterparts in Exodus and Joshua. Also, the people who are defined as ger have a vulnerable status in Israelite society, so they need to be taken care of with other vulnerable people, such as widows and orphans, with charitable support. The Deuteronomy triad of ger, orphan, widow is a well-known set from Deuteronomy, especially in the Law Code of Deuteronomy chapters 12 to 26 and the prophets. The low-key and outgroup image of ger seems to work in Exodus chapter 2, verses 21 to 27, where the ger is considered underprivileged along with the widow and the orphan, who are supposed not to be mistreated or oppressed among Israelites. However, conceptually, the passage seems to place the ger into the in-group instead of an out-group. The passage is following the Decalogue in Exodus chapter 20, and it is mentioned in part of the covenant-making process of Exodus chapters 19 to 24. The covenant-making process in Exodus chapters 19 to 24 marks a relational definition of who the Israelites are as a whole to Yahweh. So the Decalogue, Exodus chapter 20, and the following laws in Exodus chapters 21 to 23 are the covenantal stipulations or contract policies which are subordinate to the overall contract or a covenant. Therefore, although the existence of the term ger implies a distinction of the designated group from the rest, the idea that the ger is an underprivileged group of people with orphan and widow who stays theologically under the overall covenantal frame, which recognizes one group of people in relation to God. So the ger should not be understood as the outsiders who live in our land, but as people who are under the frame of the same covenant. Secondly, ger as our identity. The sympathetic perspective to the ger seems to be based on the Israelites' self-identity as ger. Abraham identifies himself as a ger in his conversation with Hittite when Abraham wanted to buy a gravesite for his wife Sarah. In the Midian wilderness, Moses named his son Gershom because he becomes a ger in a foreign land. In Psalm 39, the psalmist, who was David according to the superscription, identifies himself as a ger like his ancestors. The laws given to Israelite in favor of the ger in Exodus chapter 22, verse 21 are justified based on the Israelites' own experience. You shall not wrong a sojourner, ger, or oppress him, for you were sojourners, gerim, in the land of Egypt. In the covenantal stipulations of ethics, Exodus chapter 22, verses 15 to 31, the Israelites are prohibited from taking advantage of the widows or orphan in Exodus chapter 22, verse 22. Oppression of the ger is also prohibited because the Israelites were the ger in the land of Egypt. The passage continues to give a warning. When the ger, widow, and orphan are mistreated and cry out to God, God will listen to them. The warning reminds the readers or the audience of Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 to 25, where God hears the Israelites' own cry for help from their slavery in Egypt and remembers God's covenant with Abraham. A same petition is found in Exodus 23, verse 9. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, ger, for you are gerim in the land of Egypt. This command is written in the context of a lawsuit. Exodus chapter 23. The passage strongly encourages Israelites to practice justice toward the ger and not to oppress them, because the Israelites know the heart or soul of the ger due to their own experience in Egypt. Another similar instance is found in Leviticus 19:34. Ramirez Keeds explains the Israelites' self-identification as gerim as follows. This is a long quote, long quote from Ramirez Keeds. The majority of reference to the ger in the Old Testament are late. The experience of the exile made Israelites aware of how it feels to be a ger. After the exile, the ger became a mirror of their own story. The attitude towards the ger in the Old Testament reveals, therefore, Israelites' understanding of its own identity. That is why the command to love the ger is found in Israelites' own experience. In David's prayer in 1 Chronicles 29, verses 10 to 19, David identifies the Israelite as the gerim before God as their ancestors. The prayer is about David's preparation for the temple construction, it is worth noting that the statement immediately surrounding the verse are very similar to each other by testifying that all the abundance of the materials prepared for the construction belongs to God. The immediate literary structure suggests that the Israelites' identity as Gerim before God is based on the confession that everything that they have acquired belongs to God. A similar idea is found in the concept of the year of Jubilees, especially in relation to the possession of the land in Numbers 25. So, what is the issue of the biblical concept of Ger? A brief overview of the term Ger shows two perspectives on the word in the Old Testament. First, the Ger in Israel, and second, Israel as Ger. Theologically, Israel's self-identity as Ger becomes the basis of Israelites' attitude toward the Ger among the Israelites. However, this is not the end of the story because, as it is argued previously in the first perspective, the Ger in Israel does not place the Ger in the outgroup of Israel. The Ger is considered as an integral part of the society under the overarching covenant. Then what makes Ger different from other Israelites? It seems that the allotted land as inheritance inside a covenantal community is a significant key element in relation to the identification of the Ger. On the one hand, low social status or poverty seems to be a dominant attribute to the Ger. This particular image is based on the major biblical passages mentioning the Ger in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Leviticus pairs the poor and the Ger as the object of social welfare in Leviticus 19:10 and 23:22. In these verses, both the Ger and the poor together are designated as the beneficiaries of the generosity of those who harvest. These verses parallel the Ger with the poor side by side. On the other hand, however, this is not always the case. Another verse in Leviticus shows that Ger is not necessarily a synonym or a parallel to the concept of the poor. Leviticus chapter 25 verse 47 depicts a case where the Ger or Toshav, stranger among the Israelites, become rich enough to buy an Israelite as a hired worker to probably function as a servant or a slave. The passage is a discourse in the context of the year of Jubilee, especially of the case that Israelites buy slaves or sell themselves as slaves. This passage shows that at least conceptually, the Ger is not always locked up in a lower social or financial status in the Israelite community. Deuteronomy shows a similar perspective to Leviticus chapter 19 verse 10 and 23 verse 22 concerning the Ger, looking on them as the poor who need charitable help. In Deuteronomy 24, a series of stipulations related to the Ger are provided. Here we have a wage issue, a hired worker who is poor or needy, whether he is Israelite or a sojourner. These verses prevent perverting justice against the Ger or the orphan or taking a widow's garment in pledge. In Deuteronomy 24 verse 17. In verses 19 and 20 and 21, the text instructs Israelites to be generous to the Ger, orphan, and widow in their harvest. When Israelites reap their harvest, they are instructed not to return to the field to collect the sheaf that they left behind mistakenly. Similar teaching is given about the harvest of olives and grapes in the following verses, in verses 20 and 21. In Deuteronomy 24, where Deuteronomy triad of Ger, orphan, widow plays a significant role, the Ger seems to share a lower social status with orphan and widow, and their lower status seems to become a reason for the society's financial care for them. However, another passage in Deuteronomy reveals a more fundamental reason for giving financial help to the ger, or for the help concerning their food matter. Deuteronomy 14:22-29 instruct how to offer tithes. At the end of the passage, verses 28 and 29 on the screen, an instruction for the third year tithe is prescribed. The third year tithe is to be saved for and provided to Levites, Gerim, orphans, and widows. The Levites are listed here probably not because their social status is low or because they are targets of the social relief activity. The passage reveals that the reason that the Levites are included among the beneficiary by saying, quote, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, end quote. Grammatically, this phrase is linked only to the Levites, yet contextually, this phrase gives a good reason why orphans, widows, and the ger are considered to be taken care of financially or given food among the Israelites. It is probably because they, due to various reasons, lacked the inherited land for their food supply. This idea is expressed more clearly later in chapter 26, where the text instructs on how to celebrate the harvest and the promised land. The whole passage is framed with the land that Yahweh is giving to Israelites for an inheritance. In verse 11, the Levites and ger are explicitly mentioned. It is not hard to speculate why the two groups are mentioned together here. The common factor that the Levites and the sojourner ger share is that they do not have the allotted land for an inheritance. Therefore, lacking an inheritance is part of what defines who the ger is in the Israelite community. Another significant point is that the ger is still considered a part of the community. If ger is not counted as a legitimate member of the covenant community, the reference to ger here in this verse, verse 11, would not be necessary. This particular verse specially identifies the concept of your house, Beitecha, as the combination of you, Ata, the Levites, Vehalavi, and the ger, Vehager, who is among you. The passages continues to the reference to the third year tithe in verses 12 and 13. You see on the screen. In these verses, the Levites, the ger, orphan, and widow are listed together as the beneficiaries for the third year tithe of the Israelite produce. And again, it is because conceptually, first, they are a part of the integral community. And secondly, they are without resources to produce their own food rather than just because they are simply poor. The literal translation of orphan is fatherless, as you just mentioned. Yeah. The term seems to imply not only the loss of one's father as a person, but also being stripped of the inheritance which is related to one's father. The fatherless and widow seems to lose their father or husband, which commonly implies the loss of the link to their inheritance. Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history reinforce this conceptual understanding of the ger. Deuteronomy 31 and Joshua 8 makes it out loud in their description of the procedure of the covenant-making ceremony. After giving his final sermon, Deuteronomy 29 and 30, Moses envisages how the Israelite will perform the covenant renewal by reading the laws on the Feast of Tabernacles in every seventh year in Canaan. In Deuteronomy 31, according to these verses, all Israel comes before Yahweh for the regular hearing of the law. In verse 12, Moses commands the Levites and the elders of Israel to assemble the people, which refers to the people of Israel. The following list shows who are considered to consist of the people. The ger are to be counted as the people with men, women, and the little ones. Joshua 8 describes the actualization of the Deuteronomy 31. After the capture of Ai, Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal and performed blessing and curses. Half of the Israelites stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and the other half stood in front of Mount Ebal, which is prescribed in Deuteronomy 29. In this context, Joshua 8:33 reads as follows, as you see in the slides, and all Israel there as well as the native born. In this verse, all Israel seems to refer to the Israelites who do not hold the position of elders, officers, or judges. All of them are commanded to stand on opposite side of the Levitical priest. There is no distinction between the native born, Ezra, which means someone born in the land, and Ger. The Ger takes part in the blessings and curses performed as a part of the Israelite. The participation of the Ger in the covenantal ceremony shed a light on an understanding of many cultic regulations in Exodus and Leviticus, where the Ger holds very similar responsibilities and rights to the natives. A law of festival diet, according to which Israelites must eat unleavened bread, applies to both the native of the land and the Ger without any discrimination. Exodus 12:19. The regulations for the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, have to be observed commonly by the native Ezra and the Ger. Leviticus 16:29. In Leviticus 17 verses 8 and 9, it is regulated that a person either from the house of Israel or from the Ger who offers a burnt offering or a sacrifice that does not bring the offering to the entrance of the tent of meeting, tabernacle, should be cut off from his people. This verse presupposes that the Ger is already part of the community who might well be cut off from the people in case of mistreatment of one's sacrificial offering. The Ger is also included in the regulation for the vows or free will offerings with the house of Israel. In Leviticus chapter 22, verses 18 and 19. The Ger, as well as the native, is prohibited from doing what Egyptians or Canaanites do in Leviticus 18:26. Practice of child sacrifice to Molech was strongly prohibited for both the sons of Israel and the Ger. A Ger faces the same penalty, stoning to death, as a native when he blasphemes Yahweh's name in Leviticus 24, verse 16. Other cultic regulations are to be applied to the native and the Ger without discrimination. Reading these verses, Rantorf remarked that, quote, "The surprising fact is that in all these texts that mention the Ger and the Ezra together, the point is not their difference or contrast, but what they have in common," end quote. In the explanation of that lex talionis in Leviticus 24, 17 to 23, the law states clearly that there is no difference between the Ger and the native. Leviticus 24, verse 22 states as follows, "You shall have the same rule for the Ger and for the native, for I am the Lord your God." In a more literal sense, the phrase can be translated, quote, "There exists one judgment or same judgment to you," plural, "no matter if you are Ger or native, for I am Yahweh, your God," end quote. Both Ger and the native are included in the reference to the second person personal pronoun you, lachem, here. The reason both Ger and the natives are under the same law is because Yahweh is their God. The title Yahweh is often argued to be used in a context of covenantal relationship between God and Israel. Therefore, all of these regulations or stipulations are applied to the Ger because the Ger participate the covenantal relationship with God, as the natives do. Therefore, the above observations are in line with the idea that the Ger participate in the covenantal ceremony in Deuteronomy. Since P. Benzinger analyzed the term under the separate division of the Book of Covenant in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and the priestly sources, the distinctions among the usage of the term in different texts were recognized and have been studied accordingly, as you just studied in our workshop. In Deuteronomy, the famous Deuteronomic triad, ger, orphan, widow, signifies the social aspect of the term ger. In priestly texts, Leviticus and Numbers, the term ger is juxtaposed with the term Ezra. Together, the pair appears in the texts that deal with cultic matters. Interestingly enough, the point in the cultic regulations relate to the term ger and Ezra is, as I mentioned, not their differences or contrast, but what they have in common. What I want to emphasize here is that the usage of the term ger in both group of texts, Deuteronomy and Deuteronomistic history and priestly texts, are commonly under the covenantal frame. The ger is to be treated well and fairly with the orphan and widow because the ger joins in the covenant with Yahweh through covenant making in Exodus 19 to 24 and the covenant renewal ceremony in Joshua 8 as instructed in Deuteronomy 31. The ger has to keep the same cultic regulations as Ezra, and all of the cultic regulations inevitably imply a covenantal relationship with God. Therefore, under the covenant with Yahweh, the ger is an integral part of the Israelite community. Based on the above argument, the usage of the term ger in the Torah can be summarized as follows. Ethnically, the ger is a non-Israelite or half-Israelite. Yet the gerim are considered as an integral part of the society as a covenant community by joining in the covenant between Yahweh and Israelite. So that they are obligated to follow the covenantal laws and stipulations. The only difference of the ger from other Israelites except Levites, orphans, and widows was the lack of allotted land or an inheritance. Consequently, they are considered an underprivileged group who are in need of social support because of lack of inherited land for their food production. Now, we are looking at the disorientation of ger. The reality of the life of ger, or the later understanding of the life of ger, is described differently from what is prescribed in the regulations in Deuteronomy. Some scenes from Chronicles and prophetic texts shows how gerim among Israelites are mistreated, which is even used to evoke memories of the Israelites being forced to labor in Egypt. First Chronicles, 3 instances of the term ger are found in the book of Chronicles. First Chronicles chapter 22 verse 2, Second Chronicles chapter 2 verse 17 and 18, and chapter 30 and verse 25. The first 2 instances are especially worth noting. In First Chronicles chapter 22, David's preparation for the construction of the Jerusalem temple is described. The narrative depicts David's mobilizing the gerim to use as the labor force. Explicit reference to ger calls the reader's attention here in this verse, in chapter 22, verse 2. King David summoned the gerim and made them cut the stones for the temple construction. The purpose of gathering gerim is not explicitly mentioned in this verse. Exploitation of gerim is not explicit in the passage either. However, it is obvious from its context that the mobilization of ger is related to the preparation for the temple construction. Second Chronicles chapter 2 narrates the mobilization of the ger more clearly. According to the passage, King Solomon counted the resident alien, gerim, which were 153,600 altogether. Basically, all of them were allocated to the temple construction. 3,600 of them were assigned to be overseers to make the other 150,000 people work. This type of mobilization of the gerim for the building construction is reminiscent of Pharaoh's mobilization of Hebrews in Egypt, although it is not clearly mentioned whether the mobilization was executed for the benefit of the ger or for the exploitation of them, it is understood as the forced labor by many scholars. Most of all, the exclusive mobilization of the ger in Chronicles narrative hardly seems consonant with the way in which ger is supposed to be treated as other Israelites according to the Deuteronomistic prescription. The description in 1st and 2nd Chronicles reflect either the reality of the time of David and Solomon or an interpretation of the time of David and Solomon from the chronicler's perspective. If it reflects the time of chronicler, the chronicler's perspective towards the ger seems to be congruent with the post-exilic returned Jewish community led by Ezra and Nehemiah, who hold a strong anti-alien position. No matter what the case is, the attitude toward the ger is negative. And this negative view on the ger is somewhat embarrassing concerning the covenantal stipulations in Deuteronomy and priestly laws. 12 instances of the term ger are attested in the prophetic literature. Many of them appears in the context of God's rebuke of Israelites for their mistreatment of the orphan, widow, and the ger. The prophets criticized the leaders of Israel for their mistreatment of those weaker people in the community. This type of mistreatment is accused of being part of the unrighteousness that enacted the covenantal curses that led to being expelled from the land and going exile. A clear example is found in Ezekiel chapter 22. The people of the land are accused of extorting from the ger without justice. The passage, Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 1 to 16, lists all the detestable abomination which caused the upcoming judgment of God in verses 4 and 5. Oppression of ger is decried as a significant reason for the Israelite exile in verses 15 and 16. Jeremiah 22 verse 3 reinforces this idea. Jeremiah 21 and 22 is an oracle from the time of King Zedekiah. This oracle predicts the fall of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar, God's judgment against the house of the king of Judah, and God's commandment to the palace of the kings of Judah. The oracle makes clear that God would punish the royal house of Judah and their palace according to their deeds. The only concern in this passage is about executing justice, which includes delivering those who were robbed from the hand of their oppressors, and practicing justice and righteousness, and practicing no wrong or violence against the ger, orphan, and widow, and not shedding innocent blood. These misbehaviors can even be equated with breaking the covenant and idol worship. The oracle in Jeremiah 21 and 22 clearly states that the mistreatment of the ger, orphan, and widow, and failing to practice justice or fair judgment are the decisive reason for the Babylonian exile, which is enactment of the covenantal curses. A similar but even stronger oracle is found in Zechariah 7 verses 9 and 10. This particular oracle is targeted to the returned community. The passage explains the reason for the Babylonian exile. It is clearly stated that the Israelite, or the leaders of the Israelite, with stubborn hearts, refused to follow God's commandments. Verses 11 and 12. It is worth noting that verse 9 and 10 gives the whole list of God's commandments that the Israelite or their leaders did not listen to. The passage shows that the failure to practice true or truthful judgment and the oppression of the widow, orphan, the ger, and the poor are probably the most significant reasons for the exile and the desolation of the land. In Malachi, a similar judgment is proclaimed. Through the mouth of the prophet, God stated that he would come to put Israelite on trial. In verse 5, chapter 3, verse 5, God would testify against sorcerers, adulterers, perjurers, the oppressors of laborers, widows and orphans, and he would testify against those who stretch out the ger, those who deprive the gers of justice, and who do not fear of God. Malachi is agreed to be post-exilic by many scholars because of the use of Persian words governor, pecha, and the presupposition of the existence of the second temple. Therefore, the oracle seems to reflect a fragmentary picture of post-exilic society, Jewish society, where justice and fair judgment for the weaker members of the community, such as widow, orphan, and ger, was not in place. So, reorientation. In the previous section, I pointed out several facts in regard to the conceptualization of the term ger. Mostly in the Torah Pentateuch, the ger participates in the covenant ceremony in Deuteronomy and Joshua. Consequently, the ger is obligated to follow the covenantal stipulations and cultic laws. Although the ger is an integral part of the covenantal community, a significant element that discriminates against the ger is that the ger lacks inherited land for their food production. So the ger is to be supported with the third-year tithe together with the Levites. Also, the ger is counted with the orphans and widows as the beneficiary of charitable support and fair judgment. This conceptualization of the term ger seems to be well understood by Ezekiel and is significantly reflected in Ezekiel's vision of the new temple and the new land. The last part of the book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 to 48, is a vision of the new temple, new Torah, new land, and the new city. The oracle envisions a detailed structure of the new temple and gives instructions for the temple personnel, festivals, and rulers. In Ezekiel 47 verses 13 to 40, chapter 48 verse 29, the passage draws the ideal boundaries and divisions of the new land. The new land is divided to the 12 tribes of Israel as their inheritance. And surprisingly, in the middle of the passage, the term ger appears. In these verses, both the ger and Israelites are to be allotted the land as inheritance, as it is demonstrated in the conceptual identity of the covenant community. Inherited land is almost the only thing that distinguishes the Israelites from the ger, aside from their ethnical background. However, in Ezekiel's vision of the new land and the restored Israel, or the Israel in the eschaton, and the children of the ger, are both like the children. The Israel and the children of ger are both counted as native-born children of Israel in verse 22. Ger is counted as the native-born there, and consequently get assigned land as their inheritance in verse 23. Daniel Block quotes recognizing the theological significance of landholding in Israel. Ezekiel insists that in the new order, all distinctions between Gerim and ethnic Israelite Ezra will be eliminated. End quote. This vision of the new order can be considered a reorientation toward the ideal identity of the covenant community, which also is uttered in the theology of the year of Jubilee, as it is well stated in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23. The foundation of the theology of the year of Jubilee is that the land belongs to God ultimately. In that sense, Israelites are identified as Gerim in the eyes of Yahweh. Although it is mentioned only once in Leviticus, the statement explains all the related regulations so well, like a centerpiece in a jigsaw puzzle. It is the theological foundation that all the related regulations are built upon. The historical identity of Israelite is the son of Israel, in Leviticus 25 verse 55. However, their theological and conceptual identity is Ger or Gerim in Leviticus 25 verse 23, before Yahweh. Therefore, theologically or conceptually, Israelites and the Ger are designated to be without any difference. Ezekiel seems to make a reorientation of the identity of the Ger toward what it meant to be in the theological identity of the covenantal community by allotting land to Ger as inheritance. According to Ezekiel 48:39, the city is named as Yahweh Shammah, the Lord is there. The Ger is to participate in the allotment of the land with other Israelites in the presence of the ultimate owner. So, conclusion and implication. I try to argue that the covenant and land inheritance are two significant elements for the conceptual understanding of the term Ger in the Old Testament. Concerning the two key elements, Ezekiel seems to fill up the significant gap between the Ger and the native Israelites by legislating allotment of the land to Ger as inheritance in its vision of the restored or eschatological land. Concerning Malachi, which is directed to the post-exilic community, or Ezra and Nehemiah, where we can get a glimpse of the Jewish community of the post-exilic period, Ezekiel's vision seems far from its accomplishment. Or perhaps vision might be an oracle that reflects unsolved problem in the returned community, so it projects the solution toward an indefinite point in time. A search for the conceptualization of the term Ger in the Old Testament should stop here. However, because of the gloomy portrait of the Ger in the post-exilic returned community, Jesus' kingdom ministry beyond Jews and Paul's strenuous effort eliminate differences between the Jews and Gentiles in the early church in the New Testament seems to be more meaningful and may shed light upon our perspective of the Ger as a missional identity. Okay? So, it was a relatively long presentation, but any feedback, reflection, question? We will have less than 10 minutes reflection, feedbacks, questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Any questions?
I feel like the sojourning theme is really, maybe we'll connect more dots tomorrow morning in the New Testament, but I feel like the Old Testament is setting up this thing where as long as we are on this earth, we have a certain attachment and identification with sojourning. We are not yet at home with God's people yet. And there's always going to be an element of either welcoming sojourners or being vulnerable state as sojourners. As long as we are in even today in the church age. It seems that that's really, really important.
Yeah.
And that really there's God is almost kind of leaving us no room for tribalism or sectarianism. He doesn't want us to say, you're not welcome among us. He's seems to be saying he's very much against that. His mercy extends to those who are foreigners among us.
Oh, you're only welcome this far.
Yeah, we'll welcome you up to this point, right?
Yeah.
So even in even in our churches, there's certain types of in my context, we have what's called the serving grid or framework, which is basically okay, if we need someone to be a greeter, they like this. Do they have to have membership? Do they have to be baptized? Do they have to have this stuff together? And then it goes to the next level. Okay, if we need somebody to serve coffee, and it goes across the list, and it basically goes down all the way to working at the Connect desk, being on the prayer team, being a community group leader, worship leader, and the rest of it. So there's almost an element of it of like saying, okay, you can be up to this point. Now, I understand why we have that grid, and as a team leader and someone who wants to care for my team well, because I know that sometimes people come in and they just don't necessarily have a lot of self-awareness, and things happen, and you're like, oh man, I should have held off on, kind of bringing them on the team. It's I feel this tension very deeply, because on the one hand, I'm asking people to come serve, get up early, come unload a truck, give up every second Sunday. I'm asking something of them, and in saying that, I'm not saying hey, I need something from you. I'm saying, hey, come serve. It's going to be life-giving, right? Like when we serve is when we're the most alive as Christians, which is all true. And so in return, I try and say, you're going to be somewhat I'll take care of you on the team. The team's going to be a good spot for you. You're going to be able to thrive. But then at the same time, I also know that we're a church full of broken people. So at some point, something might go wrong. And as much as we try and put things into grids and categories and say no, this type of person can't come this far, I don't know. Maybe God's about to blow up that model.
I used to be very strong on that. And I realized that isn't really where God wants most of it. So right now, brand new in our Sunday school department, we have a man who's been coming. He came to Alpha. He says he wants to be baptized. He is not yet baptized. And they've decided that he can be a Sunday school teacher for the grade 3, 4, 5 boys with some other men who are just going to be there with him, but he's going to learn alongside, and he doesn't have to be yet figured all out. So, and I don't know I think he says he has a testimony that he's ready. And it's okay, 10 years ago, I would have thought that's really a bad idea, but I don't think it's a bad idea anymore.
Are we still within the scope of Sojourner and Old Testament?
He's a Sojourner. He absolutely showed up.
I think we have both aspects. We can find both aspects in the Old Testament concept of ger. On one hand, you and Elijah just mentioned is about we are ger in the sight of God. That's the ultimate fundamental idea. But at the same time, what I try to say is I kind of support you 10 years ago, because you see what I'm saying? Ger are considered integral part because they are already get into the covenantal relationship, which means to us is the baptism, or full commitment to Yahweh, to God or Jesus. So that's why they should be considered as an integral part, and that's what's supposed to happen there. So it is more how you're gonna treat, at least in the level of Old Testament.
Yes.
That's why I told you that don't try to apply whatever we see in the Old Testament apply to our own context directly, because in the level of Old Testament it's more it's more like it's not like they have to take care of the outsiders. They take care of ger because they are already insiders. Just like me, I am a landed immigrant and give my place to Queen Elizabeth II, which means I got my citizens. So I need to be, although I'm from Korea ethnically and geologically, but I landed immigrant and give my citizenship, get my citizenship as a Canadian. So I need to be treated as Canadians. So that's why I do pensions and the supports while I'm studying, something like that. So it is more it is more how, at least in the level of Old Testament, how we're gonna like extend our like a heart and like and hands to the outside of the church. It's more like how we gonna take care of those who are in the church. But at the same time, as you mentioned and Elijah like found out, the ultimate base is the identification of ourselves that as Ger and before the eyes of God. And it is not very emphasized in the Old Testament as far as I see, but interestingly, it is very emphasized in the New Testament, especially First Peter. So the use of the similar language in First Peter seems quite different to me than Old Testament. So so the Old Testament Ger is later on in many cases in Septuagint Greek translation. One of the two major words is proselyte, and the other one is a different one. But like it's been used in different. There's also trajectory of the shifting of the meaning of the term, I guess, throughout Old Testament, the Septuagint, and to the New Testament. And as I mentioned it at the last part of my paper, there's significant expansion based on the foundation of the meaning. And so my next project is how it's been translated in the Septuagint and what kind of different like ideas and concepts are embedded and which of them are emphasized in the New Testament books. Okay. So it'll be very interesting to see how the trajectories or changes or shift of meanings going on. But I see definitely so that's why like I said, like we don't like read the Old Testament, when we read the prophetic books, and we didn't do well to the orphans and widows, we didn't do well, so we'd be careful to our future not to get exiled. We are not looking at that. But how New Testament, like Brian Rapsky will deal with that, hopefully, and how the New Testament churches is being used from a different perspective is one very significant steps. That how they expand, because it seems to me that it's been expanded in somehow. So, okay. Other comments, feedback, or question?
And I may have been misunderstanding this. I'm not terribly familiar with Ezekiel, but it seemed like in the older books, sojourners were basically like gleaning the fields and kind of getting the leftovers. They were included and they were to be protected, but they kind of had this lower status. And then in Ezekiel, I may have misunderstood, but it seemed like land was allotted to them. And so if I'm correct there, why the progression? Is that just an elevation in status because Israel was exiled as well, or what's happening there? Or am I totally?
That is a $1 million question. But like what I can say is we can say definitely like different view in Ezekiel. That's what we can say. And interestingly, like like from other prophetic books, although I mentioned the integrity, like Ger as the integral part of the Jewish community or covenant community, but still they use the term Ger to identify some people among them, right? So there's a bit of like differences there, and to me, from my study, I just see the ethnical background and the land allotment was the two different things, like two things that actually can identify Ger different from other Israelites. And I was really interesting. It was really interesting to see that actually Ezekiel mentioned that. Like, Ezekiel just mentioned the land allotment, one thing about the Ger. And that's why I think Ezekiel, like, I'm not saying I'm spirit and Ezekiel, but Ezekiel really see the problem, see the problem, the issue, and try to solve it to make them as really no difference to other Israelites. Yeah. Yeah.
Can we get a copy of your essay? Are you willing to share that?
If you want, I can do that. And actually, this paper will be published in the fall. So but I can share it with you.
Can we get like first editions that are signed?
That's funny. I was sitting here going, you should publish this, and there it is. Sorry.
Yeah. It'll be published. But I can share it through.
Yeah, just send it to me, and I'll send it out definitely.
No problem. Yeah. Okay. I think it's the time, and I hopefully not just too much push put on too much things upon you, but hopefully you enjoyed the session, and I think this is it for today, right? And you guys will see tomorrow morning. Hopefully you are well tonight. Enjoy yourselves with your family, and see you tomorrow. You're dismissed.